You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof, the smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 305 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. Similar to Monday's show, a lot of news to cover, mostly focused on Venezuela though. So I think I have an interesting show lined up for you here today. I did want to take some time to cover some action by the Hawks lately. Matt Booth, Rachel Maddow, and Mitch McConnell. I think it's a good variety of, kind of this left-right neocon terrible kind of people alliance, and to talk about the stupid things that they're saying. Alright, so I think it'll be a cool show for y'all today. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org. That's where you can find my daily news roundup and the show, both there on the homepage. And then if you want the access to the bonus content that I produce, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. I actually just did a show this week. Start off on today's show, I just want to mention that I read that Walter Jones, Congressman Walter Jones, is in hospice care now, so end-of-life care means, unfortunately we're not going to be seeing him in the house again. I did want to just take a minute on the show to recognize that, this was really a man of high integrity and principle who, after, I think with the help of Ron Paul, was convinced that the Iraq war was a huge immoral mistake. He not only actually changed his positions, he didn't rationalize his support away like so many others did. And, either blame the Bush strategy or this general or that general or, it was Iran or Russia or whoever else that screwed that up, took responsibility, understood what taking that responsibility meant. That meant that he unnecessarily sent young American men and women to go die in the Middle East for no reason at all, counterproductive to American interests. And, I think penance or something, he wrote all these letters to soldiers, apologizing for his mistake sending them to that war. So losing somebody like Walter Jones is never a good thing. Hopefully, his legacy will inspire, conservatives to be principally non-interventionist and to take stands on the war issue, understanding that, if we really do value our military men and women, that throwing their lives away flippantly in the Middle East isn't the way to honor them. Max Boot is not a hero for saying that the Americans should remain in Syria and Afghanistan for another 100 years. This is the statement of a sick person that cares nothing about the individual men and American women and their families, who will suffer because of his policies. But, we do have things in the House going on right now. In a positive light, like this Yemen War Powers resolution. I believe there's going to be one issued in the House and the Senate. The Senate one has been introduced by Lee, Murphy, and Sanders, and they gave a little speech like they did last time. So hopefully this one goes through, and I'm not sure if it's really going to be enough to end the U.S. intervention in Yemen. There's just so many ways the executive and the Pentagon could be sneaky, but it could at least force it to be more covert. Maybe it will help to end some weapon sales to Saudi Arabia. Maybe we won't be able to sell them bombs anymore or something like that, just because that's clearly a part of the war effort. And it may force us to, remove whatever Americans are helping Saudi Arabia with their targeting and logistical support, the maintenance on their airplanes that are fighting that war in Yemen. But I also think importantly, that what this resolution will do most of all is it'll make this Yemen war debate a big deal. And when it's brought to be a big deal and, representatives like Ro Khanna are going out there and saying, look, 19 million Yemeni people lack access to clean water. And the latest stats about 14 million or so Yemeni people being on the brink of famine. That, this will be the public debate. And I don't think there's going to be any way that, anybody will really be able to justify or defend the U.S. intervention in Yemen, because it's an awful, horrific war crime that's, teetering on a famine that could definitely lead to a genocide. While I'm on the subject of Yemen and the War Powers resolutions, this is a critical time. The ceasefire that's held together for a couple months was negotiated in Stockholm is really teetering, and this ceasefire for the city of Hadada isn't critical because most of the, food aid and fuel and, what little, commercial goods are allowed into Yemen enter through the port there. And, this is the port that services about 80% of the 28 to 26 million Yemeni people. And so if fighting breaks out in this city and, Saudi Arabia has threatened to start a bombing campaign of it, so I'm sure they would be willing to just about level it and attempt to, to bring it under their control, because what do they care about Yemeni people? It could be devastating to attempting to get that food and fuel out of Hadeda and into the highlands of Yemen to a large portion of the Yemeni people. Just a few other notes on Yemen. ACLED is continuing to produce data on that war. One interesting stat, and I usually talk about, the Saudi aggression, and that's because it's backed by the Americans, but the Houthis certainly do terrible things as well. Kind of equivalent to Saudi's bombing campaign, Houthis, set up mines in areas to slow the progress of, Saudi ground forces to allow them, to attack them kind of from the highlands or in ambushes. And they do this, by just sporadically mining areas. Well, poor civilians step on those mines too, and ACLED has confirmed 267 have since 2016. Saudi Arabia claims that number is closer to 920. Now, the deal with the Saudi number is it's probably biased against the Houthis, but it is important to remember the ACLED number is the confirmed number, so they were able to, determine that this civilian was blown up by this landmine in this location. And so the actual number, there's probably people who have died stepping on random mines and nobody ever found them or, reported it to any authority official. Another note, and I'm not sure if this has any greater meaning or not, but there was a suicide bombing carried out in the port of Al-Mocha. This is actually controlled by the Yemeni-backed government, likely by AQAP or ISIS. And so it would be interesting, I suppose, if ISIS kind of turned against the UAE or Saudi-backed government there. All right, on to news about Venezuela. Maduro is rejecting calls from several nations to hold a new round of elections in Venezuela. In those elections, Maduro won another 6-year term as Venezuela's president. He was sworn in the past couple of weeks. Now, the opposition did not participate in those elections. They sat him out, claiming that they were illegitimate. So, you really do have a problem here where I don't think anybody has a firm understanding of what percentage of the Venezuelan population supports the Maduro government or not. I think it's very easy to misunderstand why people would support the Maduro government in Venezuela. And it's important to not jump to the conclusion that just because it's a communist government doesn't mean that the people are just either oppressed or brainwashed into supporting the Maduro government. He may hold legitimate popular support. I'm guessing a large reason for this is that the alternative to the communist government in Venezuela is probably a very oppressive right-wing government. And who knows whose criminal rights abuses would be worse or whose economy would be worse for the, kind of average Venezuelan. But that is certainly something for each individual Venezuelan to decide. And I really probably couldn't possibly understand all the factors that made people support either the government there or the opposition. From everything I've read, it really doesn't seem to me that there is a majority that oppose Maduro in Venezuela. There is a lot of criticism of his government, I think, from the left, who, completely reject the right-wing opposition. But I wouldn't, really count those people as voting against Maduro for the opposition in the election. But it is hard to tell. I mean, the opposition there is very fragmented. And so if they were ever able to get organized, how much of the vote they could soak up there, I think is unknown. And of course, anybody who does polling down there has likely some kind of bias. I mean, a lot of the NGOs are backed by the United States government, so they're obviously interested in setting up situations where the polling data reveals close to a 50-50 split, if not people generally dissatisfied with the government there. And of course, I think are some people, in the U.S. media who are left-wing and kind of blinded by, the left-wing desire for the Maduro government to secede, to realize that there probably is quite a bit of actual opposition to his government there. I'm not sure why all these nations are pushing for a new round of elections, just because I think Maduro would win anyways. But it doesn't seem that Maduro is going to cave to that pressure. and hold elections that he believed, I would imagine he would believe he would win. Unless, of course, he believes that, the elections, this new round of elections would somehow be rigged against him. I did read an interesting article where I guess Maduro claimed that Trump attempted to use the Colombian mafia to assassinate him. Unless he's able to produce some kind of evidence of this, I will remain very skeptical. But I did see that as a popular story and just wanted to mention it. There's an article that I'm going to link to in the show notes page. And for those of you who are kind of interested in what the actual technical situation is on the ground for the diplomats in Venezuela, Peter Van Buren had an excellent write-up in the American Conservative. Of course, he was guest on the 300th episode of this podcast. But in this article, Peter explains what the international norms are for treatment of a country's diplomats, where even if it's not the actual Venezuelan government forces, but maybe just some Venezuelan people upset with the United States trying to undermine their government, would attack an embassy or something like that. Of course, I think people would point to what happened in both Benghazi and Iran as examples of, these diplomats could be a real danger. I think Peter's take, kind of sobers some of those fears. And I think it's just a cool article if you want to read and understand how diplomacy works and kind of what the international norms are. This definitely helps, when you read the news in the future, to know if something sounds right or wrong and how skeptical you should be. So the big story around Venezuela, of course, is John Bolton's notepad. And I didn't even bother really linking to this on Immersion News or in my daily news roundup, mostly because I think it's some kind of ploy by John Bolton. He has to know, he must have walked out of hundreds of rooms or thousands of rooms after meetings like this, after his time in all these different administrations now. To know that if you're holding your, paper out that way, you could be, I would imagine, release classified information potentially, if we are going to secretly be sending these 5,000 troops to Colombia. I don't think it's impossible that these plans are actually going on, and I think it's obvious, since it was written on John Bolton's notepad, that at least Trump's national security advisor wants to send U.S. troops to Colombia. But I'm not actually convinced that this isn't John Bolton trying to kind of create the debate that didn't exist before. And so now you would have all these pundits go out and try to justify, John Bolton having this on his notepad, and then everybody starts to think it's a good idea. It's an interesting kind of tactical move, I suppose. So generally, I say try to ignore it, but if anybody is really serious about it, you should mock them for, wanting to do another Syria here. Do you really think that's going to work out any better than the first time? The White House is certainly making it clear that they're not ruling out an attack, although they're not, going out on a limb at all and saying that they're going to, not attack Venezuela. As far as it goes as who controls, the Venezuelan government, there doesn't seem to be any change on the ground in Venezuela. I've actually been, and I don't want this to sound cruel, but surprised by the lack of violence in Venezuela over the past week. I would have thought that, maybe the opposition would have tried to rally people to, take up protests either at, whatever the presidential palace is in Venezuela, try to kind of push on the gates there. Even attempt to provoke an overreaction from the Venezuelan police to try to, gain international sympathy, or that, if the protests really are large, just naturally, the Venezuelan police trying to break them up to reduce them. I have seen numbers about 20 people have died, and that's certainly sad. But, whenever I first read this news about this guy declaring himself interim president and the international community recognizing him, I was very concerned that, things could get ugly very quick. I mean, even in the, very short coup d'etat attempt in Turkey in 2016, I believe a couple hundred people ended up dying. The U.S. has placed sanctions on the Venezuelan oil company. This is a big move, especially since it hasn't happened before, but I think was very predictable. Yeah, so I think the overall goal here of the Trump administration is to really isolate the Venezuelan economy, and I guess in almost 1990s era Iraq-esque attempt to get the people to rise up and overthrow the government by making them so poor and miserable. They are transferring control of these companies to the guy claiming to be the interim president, Juan Guaido. So I'm not sure how that's going to kind of play in. Like, if the Bank of England gives this guy access to $1.2 billion Venezuelan worth of that Venezuelan gold. What's actually going to happen? Because I doubt Maduro is just going to let the guy bring it into Venezuela and then have control of $2 billion, a large portion of their economy, right? And so I can't imagine how this guy is going to spend it, unless, of course, maybe it's to facilitate weapon buys or something like that. You do have this situation where there's a couple Venezuelan military defectors living abroad asking for weapons from the U.S. government. I don't know how, serious of a defective military force that Venezuela could muster, kind of abroad. If the U.S. armed them, if they're only 20 guys, then they're not really going to be effective in any way. But if there's a few thousand, then maybe the U.S. could arm and train some of them. Either way, the U.S. shouldn't be doing that, but I don't know if this money could be used to kind of facilitate some of those transactions. I think it's estimated that Venezuela has something like $11 billion worth of assets outside of the country. I've seen that number, though, as low as $7 billion. And I guess the international community will look to cut off those funds. The Venezuelan government is moving to look to find ways and vehicles around the U.S. sanctions. Of course, this has been done now by the EU with the Iran sanctions, that they've kind of come up with a vehicle to facilitate those payments. I could see this becoming an increasing problem for the Trump administration with like the strict sanctions on Russia, Iran, and Venezuela. You could start to see some of these European countries saying like, hey, this is really starting to impact us negatively economically, and we're going to start to, violate some of the U.S. sanctions. Certainly the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which I believe would bring liquefied natural gas from Russia into Germany, is something that German companies have gone along with despite threats from the Trump administration to put secondary sanctions on them for violating U.S. sanctions against helping Russian energy infrastructure projects. I did want to note that Tulsi Gabbard seems to be the loudest voice of the potential 2020 Democratic nominees coming out against Donald Trump on this decision. So, just one reason to, throw her your support. All right, some other news. And I always find like these cases of like burn pits and Agent Orange very interesting, because you have these men and women who are so glorified by the war state and by the Congress who served overseas, suffering long-term illnesses from the kind of chemicals they were exposed to as part of their tours of duty. So you had Agent Orange in Vietnam, and famously veterans had to fight for years before receiving benefits for those treatments. And the actual, I guess, rulings and all the, kind of legislation only gave benefits to those people exposed to Agent Orange on the ground in Vietnam. A recent court ruling, however, I think a pretty overwhelming ruling, like 7-2, said that crewmen who were, deployed out in the ocean and were exposed to this on ships are also entitled to those benefits. Nikki Haley is giving a speaking tour and is getting about $200,000 per speech. I think these speaking fees, I like to use them as indications of how much, kind of people think a potential speaker has a political future influence, right? You give them $200,000 for a speech now, and then you have some influence over them later on. So certainly, Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton were getting like $250,000 or $500,000 per speech leading up to 2016. I don't know if, Nikki Haley would maybe try primary Donald Trump in 2020, but I certainly think that one day down the road she would have her eye on a presidential run. And very scary because she's a true hawk. Director of National Intelligence Dan Coats made some statements to the Senate in testimony, basically saying that he doesn't believe a deal could get done with North Korea. Everybody's kind of taking it up on, trying to mock Donald Trump. Look, his intelligence agencies don't even agree with him that a deal could be done with North Korea. This is really unfortunate because there's plenty of room for a deal to get done. They always leave out their assessments of, the positive impacts that South Korea could have and how the Korean people really seem to want peace. Now, I do think it means that Donald Trump will have to give some sanctions relief to North Korea before North Korea gives up every last nuclear weapon and intercontinental ballistic missile. But this is how negotiation works. And, if you read the art of the deal, I guess it's not too far out of line to assume that Donald Trump will make a blanket statement saying that he's, not going to relieve any sanctions until North Korea gives up its nuclear weapons. And then release some sanctions when North Korea starts to give up their locations of nuclear weapons as, being a more realistic position. This is another case too, where you could see the world start to, bypass U.S. sanctions on North Korea and do direct trade. And not only, what the U.S. would consider rogue regimes or rival powers like Iran, Russia, and China, but also even South Korea, because they want to make peace with their neighbors to the north. So on this one, at the very least, I would agree with Donald Trump over his, intelligence agencies in saying that, that there is room for a deal to be done with North Korea. And the past year, Donald Trump, I think, falsely claims a lot of credit for it, but, has shown that steps could be taken to move forward. And there's certainly a much less hostile situation right now than it was a year ago at this time. Just want to mention a dual bombing in the Philippines at a Catholic cathedral in the southern Philippines. I know there's a very complicated situation over there. I covered over the summer a situation in a city in, I believe, kind of southwestern Philippines, where ISIS actually, or an ISIS-affiliated group, took over a city and held it for well over a month. It was quite the long battle and took the Philippines a long time to liberate it. But you had this bombing. I guess ISIS claims to have carried it out. 20 people dead. So this is very unfortunate. And the president there has ordered the military to go hunt down the perpetrators. Hopefully this doesn't spark wider violence in the Philippines, where I know there are like opposition groups and stuff like that. We had what should be some good news, and that is the U.S. Trump administration lifting sanctions on 3 Russian companies. These companies actually complied with the complaints that the U.S. made when they were sanctioned. Basically said the U.S. said that these companies were too closely associated with an ally of Vladimir Putin. And then the shareholders and the board members of these companies actually voted to distance themselves from this man. Now, they weren't able, to completely kick him out of the company, I guess, get rid of all of his shares. But he has taken a much smaller role in these companies. And, therefore, the Trump administration lifted the sanctions on them. Now, there's an outcry from the media saying, oh, this is proof that Trump is a puppet of Vladimir Putin, and how foolish of him to get duped by the Russians on this one. But I mean, what are you going to do? There's people in Russia, like the Russian people are people. They're not just, nasty, evil people looking to undermine U.S. democracy, who, have invested in this company, and the company does much better when it's able to do business abroad. And so they have to get rid of U.S. sanctions, and they go and they comply with the complaints that the U.S. made when they sanctioned those companies. And then, they're moving the goalposts and now saying that's not good enough. We have to keep the sanctions on. And it's all because of this ridiculous demonization of Russia that continues to go on in the media. Hopefully this last blunder by Rachel Maddow officially just kills this Russiagate conspiracy, where she did like a whole 1 minute fear mongering thing about how Russia could turn off all the power in America right now. And with, the cold temperatures in the, northern Midwest region, it could kill millions of people, and how terrible this would be. Well, yeah, the power could go out and then people could die, but there's an awful lot of reasons for this, and there's no reason to think Russia could do it. You could also claim that Canada would do it. They're certainly militarily capable. But fear-mongering claims like this are so shallow and so cheap that I hope it is going to start waking people up to the realization that all this Russia stuff is fear-mongering, nothing else. In fact, one of these stories that was picked up on a few times, and I never really gave it the dignity of mentioning it on the show, but certainly has just been proven to be another completely false Russiagate claim, is there was this, I believe, high-value escort, or I think she called herself a sets coach, from Belarus, who ended up in, I believe, a Thailand prison, and was concerned about, possibly being killed, and claimed that she had evidence that Donald Trump colluded with a Russian oligarch who is close to Vladimir Putin. Well, she has now come out and said that she made this up because she knew that it would bring attention to her and that would keep her alive. It certainly worked. So I'm not trying to say that all in all it's a terrible thing, but certainly it's just another one of these Russiagate claims that was, oh, this, woman has, and they gave, never called her a prostitute because they liked what she was saying, has all this information that, Trump colluded with Russia. And again, this one turns out to be completely false. In nuclear weapons fears, and I always throw this in with the Russia thing because Of course, those are our nuclear weapon rivals. The United States has started to produce these low-yield nuclear weapons. About 5 kilotons of TNT is the size of the nuke. So I think that's about 1/3 of Hiroshima, if I'm remembering my nuclear weapons strikes correctly. So not a gigantic bomb, but at the same time, a very large nuclear weapon still. And, people are concerned this will lower the kind of threshold for carrying out a nuclear strike, where if you only have really big bombs, only city-killing bombs, then if you're not willing to kill a city, then you can't use your nuclear weapons. However, if you have smaller nuclear weapons that are, maybe capable of taking out like an army in the countryside or something, then you carry out a nuclear first strike with that weapon, but then, it's all out nuclear war from there once nuclear weapons are used. In some other intelligence agency testimony in front of the Senate, we had Gina Haspel, who's the director of the CIA, saying that Iran continues to live up to the nuclear agreement, the JCPOA, even though the U.S. withdrew from it. This has also been certified by the IAEA. So I think this whole scheme by the Trump administration, hoping that they would vacate the nuclear agreement and then Iran would go and at least violate the nuclear deal, if not, start making nuclear weapons, giving the Houthis an excuse to go to war with Iran. But since Iran has remained within the deal and Europe has now produced this payment vehicle to start facilitating payments between Iran and Europe, bypassing U.S. sanctions. Now, of course, the threat of secondary sanctions from the U.S. continues to be there. So companies may not still do business with Iran. But these are all steps that I think suggest the Trump administration's policy on Iran really hasn't played out how they have planned. And it's probably because, Trump surrounds himself with these Iran hots. And this is something that Jib Lobe points out in a pretty good article. I'll link to it in the show notes page, just how concerned him and co-author Ben Armbruster are that, we really could be in a situation where, and as sad as this is to say, without James Mattis of all people as Secretary of Defense, who's going to stop John Bolton from pushing towards more hostility with Iran? The U.S. has filed charges, or revealed publicly the charges against Huawei. Of course, they're Chinese. That's a Chinese company, and the executive is being held in Canada. This has sparked a little bit of a diplomatic issue between China and Canada, but the United States is claiming that they're violating U.S. sanctions against Iran. Now, why the Chinese and the Russians shouldn't be able to do business with each other really doesn't make sense. But of course, those are the U.S. sanctions, and so we're going to, arrest executives of companies around the world because of it. Something I've talked about on the show several times because I want to always be out front of this war state lie. They always claim that Iran is testing ballistic missiles when they launch rockets into outer space carrying satellites. Carrying a rocket into space with a satellite is, a completely fair economic thing that all countries should be able to do. And Iran is certainly, a normal state that should be able to do that. But the United States, every time they launch one of these, they say, oh, it's a metal tube that carries a lot of fuel, which means it could be an ICBM. However, there's plenty of, good information from actual rocket scientists explaining how a space rocket is different than a ballistic missile. The burn times on the engines are different. The way you compact the fuel and the payload, where it's placed in the rocket, all of these things are very different. And so, a space rocket program isn't a ballistic missile program and doesn't help lead to one either. In fact, the only country who had a space, economic space program before having an ICBM is North Korea, and they have completely different designs from their ICBM to their space rocket. I have a lot of other stuff I want to talk about, but I do have to wrap up the show here. Before I wrap up the show, I did want to mention an article by Matt Spoot and some action in the Senate by Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. McConnell entered an amendment that would undermine Trump trying to leave Afghanistan. And Matt Spoot's article, I think, explains basically now the position of the war party on Syria and Afghanistan, which is we have to stay even though we can't win. They say it doesn't even matter about winning and losing anymore. We're not fighting there to win. And Matt Spoot in his column says, look, Afghanistan and Syria, they're like the insurgency the U.S. fought against the Indians. There were terrible atrocities there. However, we don't do those in the Middle East, and what's going on right now is going to be a 100-year war, but we're committed to it and we need to win it. It's complete insanity. And I don't know, hopefully, like Maddow on the temperature thing, this is going to just be so obviously ridiculous that if this is all the war party can muster as an excuse to stay in Afghanistan, that, oh, we have to stay there for 100 years so we don't lose, then the people they have to reject it, I imagine. I hope. All right, that's where I'll wrap up the show. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. The news website is immersionnews.com, and you can check me out on mine there.